The rain hit the windshield so hard that Elena Voss could barely see the gate ahead of her. She gripped the wheel tighter, her knuckles pale, her heart pounding, for reasons that had nothing to do with the storm. 5 years. 5 years since she had driven this same road, and now she was doing it again. Only this time she was not running toward someone. She was running toward a job, a fresh start, and a life she had promised herself she would build far away from every memory that lived inside these mountains. The security guard at the gate leaned into her window, his flashlight cutting through the downpour. He looked at her ID twice before his eyes widened. "Dr. Voss," he said slowly. "We were told a new physician was coming. Nobody said it would be you." "It's me," she said, forcing a small smile. "Is there a problem?" He hesitated, glanced over his shoulder at the dark shape of the main lodge on the hill, then shook his head. "No, ma'am. Just surprised. Welcome back to Blackthorn Ridge." The gate lifted, and Elena drove through with a knot tightening in her stomach. She had told herself 100 times on the drive up that this would be fine. Cain Ashford was the Alpha King now, busy running an entire territory, probably married, probably a father, probably a man who had long since stopped thinking about the woman who vanished from his life the same week he vanished from hers. She was not coming back for him. She was coming back because the offer was too good to refuse, because her mentor had personally requested her, and because somewhere deep inside her, she needed to prove that this place could not break her twice. She parked outside the clinic building and sat for a moment, listening to the rain drum on the roof of the car. Then she stepped out, pulled her coat tight, and walked toward the front doors. She never saw the tall figure standing at the window of the lodge above, watching her car pull in. She never saw him go very still, his jaw tightening, his eyes narrowing on the woman he thought he would never see again. Cain Ashford had buried this feeling a long time ago, or so he believed. Inside the clinic, Elena was met by a woman with kind eyes and a clipboard, who introduced herself as Priya, the head nurse. Priya walked her through the intake rooms, the supply closets, the small laboratory in the back, chatting easily about schedules and staff. Elena nodded along, grateful for the distraction, grateful that nobody here seemed to know her history, or so she thought. "You'll be seeing PAC members of all ages," Priya explained. "Adults, elders, and children too. We don't have a dedicated pediatric doctor, so you'll be doing a bit of everything." "That's fine," Elena said. "I like variety." Priya smiled, but something flickered behind her expression, gone before Elena could name it. "There's someone I should mention. The Alpha's ward. A young boy. He comes in more often than most, mild issues mostly, nothing serious. But he can be shy with new faces." "The Alpha's ward?" Elena repeated. "Not his son?" "No," Priya said, a little too quickly. "Just his ward. Long story. You'll meet him eventually, I'm sure." Elena filed the comment away without much thought. She had bigger things to worry about, like unpacking her boxes, finding her way around a territory she had once known by heart, and avoiding, as long as possible, any encounter with the man whose name she still could not say out loud. That encounter did not wait long. It happened the very next morning, in the corridor outside the clinic's main office. Elena was reviewing patient files when the door opened and a tall man stepped through, broad-shouldered, dressed simply in a dark jacket, his presence somehow filling the entire hallway before he even said a word. Elena looked up, and every carefully rebuilt wall inside her chest cracked at once. Cain. He looked older, harder, his jaw sharper, a small scar above his eyebrow that had not been there before. But his eyes were the same, that same storm gray color that used to soften the moment he looked at her. Except now they did not soften. Now they went wide with something between shock and disbelief, and then, just as fast, shut down into something guarded and cold. "Elena," he said, and her name in his voice felt like being struck by lightning. "Cain," she managed. "I didn't know you would be here." "This is my territory," he said flatly. "I am the Alpha King. Where else would I be?" The words landed harder than he probably meant them to. Elena straightened her spine, refusing to let him see how much the sight of him still undid her. "Of course. I'm sorry. Dr. Merrick recommended me for the position, and I accepted before I knew who was in charge here now. If it's a problem, I can request a transfer." For a long moment, Cain said nothing. His eyes moved over her face, as if searching for something, some explanation for why she was standing in his hallway, after 5 years of silence. 5 years in which she never once called, never once wrote, never once tried to find him after the night everything fell apart. "It's not a problem," he said finally, though his tone suggested otherwise. "The pack needs a physician. Stay. Do your job. We don't need to make this complicated." "No," Elena said quietly. "We don't." He turned and walked away, and Elena stood there long after the door closed behind him, her hands trembling, old grief rising in her throat, like water behind a cracked dam. She had spent years convincing herself she was over him, over the accident, over the baby she lost, the same week he disappeared without a single word. She had built an entire life on that foundation of moving forward, and in less than 1 minute, all of it felt like it was made of glass. She did not know, could not have known, that Kane was doing the exact same thing on the other side of that door, standing with his back against the wall, breathing hard, fighting the same storm of memory that had just hit her. He remembered the night she told him she was carrying his child. He remembered the joy on her face, and his own disbelief, the way his entire future had suddenly reorganized itself around the idea of a family. He remembered promising her he would tell his father immediately, that nothing, not pack politics, not old rivalries, not tradition, would stand between them and the life they wanted to build. Then he remembered nothing. No goodbye, no explanation, just silence, and rumors that reached him weeks later that she had been in some kind of accident, that the pregnancy had ended, that she had left the territory entirely, rather than face him again. He had never understood why she left without a word. He had spent years telling himself it was because she blamed him, because grief had made her run from everything connected to that loss, including him. He had let that story calcify into fact, because the alternative, that someone had taken that choice away from both of them, was too dangerous a thought to hold on to without proof. What Kane did not know, what he could not have imagined even in his darkest suspicions, was that his own brother had intercepted Elena's message that night. Damon Ashford, second in line, ever watchful of the pack's bloodline and its politics, had read her words meant for Kane, and decided, in a single selfish moment, that a human mate carrying the future Alpha's child was a threat too large to allow. He never told Kane the message existed. He made sure Elena believed, through careful lies delivered by people she trusted, that Kane had chosen silence over her, and when the accident happened days later, an accident that was real, though not as fatal as everyone assumed, Damon saw an opportunity, and made certain that both Kane and Elena believed the pregnancy had ended in that wreck. The truth was far different, and far more dangerous. The child had survived. A boy, born quietly at a remote clinic outside pack territory, placed under careful watch, then brought back to Blackthorn Ridge months later, under the story that he was an orphan, a distant relative of a family lost in a border skirmish, taken in by the Alpha out of duty and kindness. Kane had raised that boy for years, believing him to be nothing more than his ward, a child he felt responsible for, a child he had grown to love, without ever suspecting the truth pumping through his own blood. Elena spent the rest of that first day moving through the clinic in a fog, greeting patients, reviewing charts, trying to focus on anything except the memory of Kane's eyes in that hallway. By late afternoon, the rain had cleared, and golden light spilled through the clinic windows, and for a while, she allowed herself to believe the worst was behind her. She had seen him. She had survived it. Surely the rest would be easier. Then the door to the waiting room opened, and a small boy walked in, holding the hand of an older woman Elena recognized as one of the pack's caretakers. "He took a fall this morning," the woman explained. "Nothing broken, I think, but his ankle is swollen." Elena knelt down to the boy's level, offering a gentle smile. "Hi there, I'm Dr. Voss. Can you tell me your name?" The boy studied her with careful, curious eyes, the kind of eyes that seemed far too watchful for someone so young. "Ryder," he said. "It's nice to meet you, Ryder. Can I take a look at your ankle?" He nodded, and Elena gently examined the joint, checking for swelling, for range of motion, keeping up a steady stream of soft reassurance the entire time. It was routine. It was simple. And then Ryder laughed at something the caretaker said, a bright, sudden sound, and Elena's hands went still. That laugh. She had heard that exact laugh before, years ago, From a man who used to tease her relentlessly about her terrible sense of direction, who used to throw his head back the same way, at the same angle, with the same crinkle at the corner of his eyes. She looked up at the boy's face properly for the first time, really looked, and felt the floor tilt beneath her, the shape of his jaw, the particular gray of his eyes, not quite blue, not quite silver, the way his eyebrows arched when he was thinking hard about something. "Dr. Voss?" the caretaker asked. "Is something wrong?" Elena blinked hard and forced herself back into the moment, her professional training kicking in, even as her mind reeled. "No," she said, her voice not quite steady. "Sorry. Just distracted for a second. His ankle is a mild sprain. Ice, rest, and it should heal within a week. Nothing to worry about." The caretaker thanked her and led Ryder out, the boy glancing back once at Elena, with an expression that seemed, impossibly, curious about her too, as if some part of him recognized something he could not name. Elena sat alone in the exam room for a long time after they left, her hands pressed flat against her knees to keep them from shaking. It was a coincidence. It had to be a coincidence. Grief could do strange things to the mind, make people see echoes of the ones they lost in strangers, in children, in the faces of people who simply happened to share a similar look. She told herself this over and over, trying to build the thought into something solid enough to stand on. But that night, lying awake in the small cabin the pack had provided her, staring at the ceiling while the wind moved through the trees outside, Elena could not stop thinking about the boy's laugh, about his eyes, about the impossible, terrifying question rising inside her chest, like something that refused to be silenced. What if her son had not died in that accident at all? She told herself it was impossible. She told herself grief was playing tricks on her. That exhaustion from the drive, and the shock of seeing Kane again, had left her mind vulnerable to seeing patterns that were not there. She told herself all of this, and none of it was enough to let her sleep. Somewhere on the other side of the territory, in the grand quiet of the Alpha's lodge, Kane sat by the fire with a glass of untouched water, and found his mind circling back, again and again, to the woman in the clinic hallway, to the years of silence, to the questions he had never let himself ask because he was afraid of the answers. Beside him, curled on the rug with a worn storybook, Ryder yawned and rubbed his eyes, unaware that the two adults who loved him most in this world were, at this very moment, only a heartbeat away from the truth that had been stolen from all three of them. Down the hall, in a private study lined with old maps and older secrets, Damon Ashford poured himself a drink and stared out at the dark tree line, his expression unreadable. He had heard, of course, that the new physician had arrived. He had heard her name the moment the paperwork crossed his desk, and his stomach had dropped the way it always did when the past threatened to walk back through the front door. He told himself the same thing he had told himself for years. It was handled. It was buried. Nobody would ever know. He was wrong, and somewhere deep down, in the part of himself he refused to listen to, he already knew it. Elena did not sleep. By the time the first gray light touched the tree line outside her cabin window, she had already convinced herself, then unconvinced herself, then convinced herself again, that she was imagining things that could not possibly be true. She got dressed, made coffee she barely drank, and walked to the clinic early, hoping the routine of work would settle the storm in her chest. It did not. Every patient who walked through the door that morning seemed to remind her of the boy from the day before. A mother brought in her toddler for a checkup, and Elena found herself staring too long at the shape of the child's eyebrows, searching for a resemblance that was not there. An elder came in for his monthly blood pressure reading, and Elena's mind wandered so far that she had to ask him to repeat himself twice. By midday, Priya pulled her aside with a look of gentle concern. "You seem distracted," Priya said. "Rough first night?" "Something like that," Elena admitted. She hesitated, then decided honesty, at least a small piece of it, might help settle her nerves. "The boy who came in yesterday, Ryder, can you tell me more about him? You said he was the Alpha's ward." Priya's expression shifted, careful, guarded in a way that Elena was beginning to recognize as a pattern among the staff whenever his name came up. "There isn't much to tell. His parents died in a border skirmish with a rival pack years back. Alpha Kane took him in shortly after, raised him like his own ever since." "How long ago was that?" "Around 6 years now, give or take." Priya studied her for a moment. "Why do you ask?" Elena forced a light shrug, though her heart was pounding. He just seemed familiar somehow. Probably nothing. 6 years. Elena did the math in her head for what felt like the 100th time since the accident, and the number lined up with a precision that made her stomach twist. Her son would be 6 years old now, if he had lived. If the accident that ended her pregnancy had actually happened the way she remembered it, the way the doctors had told her it happened, in the blur of pain medication and grief that followed those terrible days. She told herself to stop. She told herself this was exactly the kind of thinking that could destroy a person, chasing ghosts in the faces of children who deserved better than to be mistaken for someone else's lost child. And yet the thought would not leave her alone. That afternoon, she found an excuse to visit the PAC's administrative building, telling herself she needed to review updated health records for incoming patients. In truth, she wanted to see if there was a file on Ryder, some record of his history that might put her mind at ease, one way or another. The records office was a quiet room lined with locked cabinets, and an elderly clerk named Garrett, who guarded them with the seriousness of a man protecting royal treasure. He was polite enough when Elena explained she needed general health records for PAC children under her new care, and he pulled a thin folder for Ryder without much hesitation, sliding it across the desk. Elena opened it carefully, scanning the details. Basic vaccination history, height and weight measurements over the years. A note about a mild allergy to a particular plant found near the eastern woods, and a single line near the top of the file that made her breath catch. Birth records. Sealed, transferred from outside territory clinic. Guardian assigned by Alpha decree following death of biological parents. No names. No location, no specifics at all beyond the barest outline of a story that felt, the longer Elena stared at it, deliberately vague. "Is this normal?" she asked Garrett, keeping her voice light. "For a child's birth records to be sealed like this?" Garrett glanced at the file, then shrugged. "Happens sometimes, especially with children brought in from outside territories after tragedy. Nobody wants to dig up painful history for a grieving child. The Alpha himself requested privacy on this one, if I remember right." "Of course," Elena said, closing the folder gently. "Thank you for your help." She left the records office with her mind spinning faster than before, the vague official language doing nothing to calm the growing certainty settling into her bones. Sealed records. No names. A convenient story about a border skirmish that no one seemed to know many details about. It could all be exactly what it appeared to be, a private tragedy, handled with discretion. Or it could be something else entirely. That evening, unable to bear another sleepless night without answers, Elena did something she had promised herself she would never do again. She drove out past the territory border to the small clinic where she had been treated after her accident 5 years earlier. The same clinic that had told her, in the haze of medication and grief, that her pregnancy had ended. The clinic looked smaller than she remembered, tucked at the edge of a town that had not changed much in 5 years. She parked outside and sat in her car for a long moment, gathering the courage to walk inside and ask a question she was terrified to have answered. The receptionist who greeted her was new, someone Elena did not recognize, but after some gentle explanation and a request to speak with anyone who might have handled her case, an older nurse named Miriam appeared from the back offices, her brow furrowing slightly at the mention of the date and circumstances Elena described. "I remember that case," Miriam said slowly, studying Elena's face as if trying to place her. "You were the young woman brought in after the accident on the mountain road. Bad crash. We were worried about you for days." "What happened to my pregnancy?" Elena asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was told I lost the baby. I need to know if that's true." Miriam's expression grew troubled, and she glanced around the small waiting area before lowering her voice. "That case was unusual. There were complications with the paperwork afterward. A man came in claiming authority on behalf of your family, said he would handle notifying you of the outcome personally, and requested that our records be transferred to his custody, rather than released through normal channels. It was strange, but he had documentation, credentials that checked out at the time. We assumed it was a family matter." Elena's heart pounded so hard she could hear it in her ears. "Do you have a name? Do you remember who that man was?" Miriam disappeared into the back for several long minutes, and when she returned, she held a thin, dust-covered folder in her hands, the edges yellowed with age. She flipped through it carefully, then pointed to a signature scrawled across a transfer authorization form. Elena stared at the name, and the world around her seemed to go silent and distant all at once. Damon Ashford, the Alpha's brother. The man Elena had met only briefly since her return. Always polished, always watchful, always seeming to appear at the edges of conversations without quite joining them. The name burned into her mind like a brand, rearranging every assumption she had carried for 5 years into something far darker and more deliberate than simple grief and tragedy. "Do you know if my baby survived?" Elena asked, her voice shaking now, all pretense of calm abandoned. Miriam's face softened with sympathy, though her answer offered no comfort. "I truly don't know, dear. The records were transferred out before we could complete our own documentation. I always wondered about that case, if I'm honest. It never sat right with me. But I had no authority to question a man with credentials from the Ashford family." Elena thanked her through numb lips and walked back out to her car in a daze, gripping the steering wheel without starting the engine for a long time, staring blankly at the darkening road ahead. Every piece was beginning to fit together into a shape too horrifying to fully accept. If Damon had intercepted her records, if he had personally arranged for their transfer, then the story she had believed for 5 years, that her son had died in that crash, might have been nothing more than a lie, constructed to serve some purpose she could not yet understand. And if that was true, then the boy with Kane's laugh and Kane's eyes, the boy she had examined in her clinic just yesterday, was not simply a resemblance born of grief and imagination. He might be her son. She drove back to Blackthorn Ridge through the darkness, her mind a battlefield of hope and fear so intense she could barely breathe. She wanted to march straight into the Alpha's lodge and demand answers from both Kane and his brother, but something held her back, a caution born of 5 years of pain, and the terrifying possibility that she might be wrong, that she might be building an entire fragile hope on nothing more than a mother's desperate longing. She needed proof, real proof, not records that could be explained away, not laughter that could be coincidence, not eyes that might simply be common among the wolves of this territory. She needed something undeniable. The next morning, Elena arrived at the clinic with a plan forming carefully in her mind, one that required patience she was not sure she possessed, and courage she would need to summon from somewhere deep inside herself. She would find a reason, a medical reason, to run a blood test on Ryder. Something routine enough not to raise suspicion, thorough enough to give her the answer she both desperately wanted and desperately feared. She did not have to wait long for her opportunity. By mid-morning, the same caretaker who had brought Ryder in 2 days earlier returned, this time with the boy complaining of a mild fever and a scratchy throat. Elena examined him gently, taking her time, her hands steady despite the storm raging beneath her calm exterior. "Just to be thorough," she told the caretaker, "I'd like to run a quick blood panel, given the fever. It's standard procedure for anything unexplained in young children. Nothing to worry about." The caretaker agreed without hesitation, and Elena drew a small sample from Ryder's arm with practiced gentleness, distracting him with a story about a bird she had seen outside her cabin window that morning, keeping his attention away from the brief pinch of the needle. He barely flinched, watching her with those same curious, careful eyes that had haunted her thoughts for 2 days straight. "You're very brave," Elena told him softly, sealing the small vial of blood. "My father says I'm the bravest wolf in the territory," Ryder said proudly, and something in Elena's chest cracked wide open at the easy, natural way he said the word father, at the obvious devotion in his voice when he spoke of Kane. "I'm sure he's right," Elena managed, her throat tight. After the caretaker led Ryder out, promising to return in a few days for the fever to be checked again, Elena stood alone in the exam room holding the small vial in her trembling hands. Somewhere in this tiny sample of blood was an answer that could change everything, an answer she was not entirely sure she was ready to receive. She locked the vial carefully in the small refrigerated unit in the back laboratory, planning to run the comparison test late that night, when the clinic was empty, and no curious eyes would ask questions about why the new physician was comparing a child's genetic markers to her own. As the day wore on, Elena caught sight of Kane once more, standing at a distance near the edge of the training grounds, watching his pack members spar in the afternoon sun. He looked tired, she noticed, more tired than a man simply managing pack business should look. There was a weight behind his eyes that had not been there 5 years ago, a heaviness she recognized because she carried the same weight herself. For one brief, unguarded moment, their eyes met across the distance, and neither looked away immediately. Something passed between them, something neither of them could name, buried beneath years of unanswered questions and unspoken grief. Then Kane turned back to his pack, and Elena forced herself to walk on, her heart heavy with the secret she was carrying, and the truth she was only hours away from uncovering. That night, long after the clinic had emptied and the last lights in the administrative buildings had gone dark, Elena sat alone at the small laboratory bench, the vial of Ryder's blood beside a sample of her own, the equipment humming softly in the silence around her. Her hands shook as she prepared the comparison, and for a moment she simply sat there, staring at the two small samples, terrified of what the results might reveal, and equally terrified of what they might not. Whatever the truth was, she was about to find it, and nothing in her life would ever be the same again. The results took longer than Elena expected, the small laboratory machine humming through its cycles while she paced the narrow space between the counters, unable to sit still, unable to think of anything except the two vials sitting side by side under the sterile light. She had run enough genetic panels in her career to know exactly what she was looking for, exactly how to read the markers that would either confirm or deny the impossible hope building inside her chest. She had also never before run a test where her entire heart hung on the outcome. When the screen finally displayed the comparison, Elena stood frozen, staring at numbers and markers that told a story too clear to argue with. Shared genetic markers, consistent with a direct parent-child relationship, the kind of result that left no room for coincidence, no room for doubt, no room for the careful denial she had been holding on to for 2 days. Ryder was her son. She pressed a hand over her mouth, tears rising so fast she could not stop them. Relief, and fury, and grief crashing into her all at once. He was alive. He had been alive this entire time, raised just a short walk from where she now stood, calling another man father, while she had spent 5 years believing he was gone. The joy of knowing he was alive fought fiercely against the horror of everything that had been stolen from her. Every first step, every first word, every birthday she had never known to grieve, because she had been told, cruelly and falsely, that there was nothing left to grieve. She sat down hard on the small stool beside the bench, letting herself cry for a long moment, the sound swallowed by the empty clinic around her. When the worst of it passed, she wiped her face with the back of her hand and forced herself to think clearly. She could not simply walk into the Alpha's lodge and announce this to Kane without proof he could not dismiss, without a complete picture of what had happened and who was responsible. She needed to be certain of every detail before she risked shattering whatever fragile peace Ryder currently had in his life, and before she gave Damon Ashford, whoever else might be involved, any chance to bury the truth even deeper. She spent the rest of that night documenting everything methodically, printing the test results, writing out a timeline of what she knew: her pregnancy, the accident, the falsified record transfer signed by Damon, the sealed file in Ryder's pack records, and now the genetic confirmation sitting in black and white before her. She locked the documents in her own private case, the kind she used for sensitive medical files, and hid it beneath a loose floorboard in her cabin that she had noticed on her first night back, a habit born of old instincts she never quite let go of. The next few days passed in a strange, suspended tension. Elena went through the motions of her work, treating patients, attending staff meetings, nodding along to conversations she barely absorbed, all while carrying the enormous secret of her discovery like a stone, lodged permanently in her chest. She avoided Kane where she could, terrified that one look into his eyes would break the careful composure she needed to maintain, until she had gathered enough information to confront the situation properly. She was not naive enough to believe Damon had acted entirely alone in covering his tracks so thoroughly for 6 years. Someone had helped falsify records at the outside clinic. Someone had helped construct the story of Ryder's deceased parents and the border skirmish that, according to every record Elena could find, had strangely thin documentation for an event supposedly significant enough to leave a child orphaned. She began, carefully and quietly, to pull threads wherever she could without drawing attention to herself. She found an old pack historian, a soft-spoken elder named Owen who kept meticulous records of territory conflicts going back decades, and under the guise of curiosity about pack history for a general health archive she claimed to be compiling, she asked him about border skirmishes from around the time Ryder would have arrived at Blackthorn Ridge. Owen frowned thoughtfully, flipping through his careful ledgers. That's odd, he murmured, half to himself. I don't have any recorded conflict along the borders during that particular season. There were tensions, certainly, always tensions with the neighboring packs, but nothing significant enough to result in casualties that I documented. I would have remembered something like that. Are you certain? Elena pressed gently. Quite certain, Owen said, closing his ledger with a small, puzzled shake of his head. I keep very thorough records, Dr. Voss. If there had been a skirmish resulting in the death of pack members or outsiders, I would have logged it. I have no memory, and no record, of any such event. Elena thanked him, and left with her suspicions confirmed even further. The story of Ryder's parents dying in a border conflict appeared to be entirely fabricated, a convenient explanation constructed to explain his sudden presence in the pack, without inviting deeper questions. It painted an increasingly disturbing picture of a deliberate, carefully executed deception, one that had required planning, resources, and the cooperation of people willing to lie for years to maintain the illusion. That evening, walking back toward the clinic through the quiet paths of the territory, Elena found herself unexpectedly face to face with Kane again, this time near the small garden behind the administrative building, where he appeared to be walking alone, his expression distant and troubled in the fading light. Elena, he said, stopping when he saw her, his voice softer than it had been in their earlier encounters. I wasn't expecting to see you out here. I was just finishing up some records work, she said, keeping her voice as steady as she could manage, though her heart was pounding at the sight of him. They stood in awkward silence for a moment, the weight of 5 years, and everything unsaid hanging heavy between them. Finally, Kane spoke again, his eyes searching her face in a way that made her chest tighten. I've been thinking about you a lot since you arrived, about everything that happened before you left. I never understood why you disappeared the way you did, without a word, without any explanation. I told myself for years that you left because you blamed me for something, or because grief made it impossible to stay somewhere connected to that pain. I never got the chance to ask you properly. Why did you leave, Elena? Elena's breath caught in her throat. Here it was, the opening she had both wanted and dreaded, the chance to finally speak the truth she had carried alone for so long. But she was not ready. Not yet. Not without more proof. Not without understanding the full scope of what Damon had done, and why. If she told Kane everything now, in this quiet garden with no witnesses and no evidence beyond a single blood test he might dismiss in his shock and confusion, she risked giving whoever was truly responsible time to cover their tracks even further. I left because I believed I had nothing left to stay for, she said carefully, choosing each word with painful precision. I was told you knew about the baby and chose silence. I was told the pregnancy ended in the accident. I believed both of those things completely, Kane. I had no reason not to. Something shifted in Kane's expression, a flicker of confusion and old pain. I never knew about any pregnancy until it was far too late to matter. Nobody told me anything, Elena. I only heard rumors weeks later that you had been in an accident and left the territory. I searched for you, for a while, before I convinced myself you wanted to be left alone. The confirmation of his own confusion, his own lack of knowledge, settled something painful and clarifying in Elena's chest. He truly had not known. Whatever had happened, whoever had engineered the silence between them, Kane himself was as much a victim of the deception as she was. I need to tell you something, Elena said quietly, the words rising unbidden despite her earlier resolve to wait. But not here, not like this. I need a little more time to be certain of everything before I bring it to you, because what I've found, it's going to change everything, Kane. For both of us. Kane studied her carefully, concern deepening in his gray eyes. Elena, whatever it is, you can tell me. Whatever happened, I want to know. Soon, she promised, though her voice trembled with the effort of holding back everything crowding behind her lips. I promise you, soon. I just need to be sure I have everything right first. He did not press her further, though his expression remained troubled as they parted ways in the fading evening light. Elena walked back to her cabin with her heart racing, the conversation replaying over and over in her mind. The realization brought both relief and fresh anger. Relief that he had not chosen silence over her the way she had believed for 5 years, and anger at the person who had orchestrated such a cruel and thorough deception between two people who had once loved each other completely. Over the following days, Elena continued her careful investigation, gathering small pieces of evidence wherever she could find them, without drawing suspicion. She spoke quietly, with old contacts from her previous years in the territory, people who remembered the chaos following her accident, people who recalled strange instructions coming down from the Ashford family regarding the handling of her case. Slowly, methodically, she built a picture of a cover-up more extensive than she had initially imagined, one that stretched across multiple locations and involved more people than just Damon alone. Meanwhile, she made a point of seeing Ryder as often as she reasonably could, under the guise of monitoring his recovering fever, savoring every small moment with her son, even as the ache of 5 stolen years pressed heavier against her heart with each visit. She watched him laugh, watched him ask curious questions about the world, with the same restless intelligence she remembered in herself as a child, watched the easy affection between him and the caretakers and pack members, who clearly adored him. He was happy here. He was loved here. And that knowledge complicated everything, because whatever truth she eventually revealed would inevitably upend the only life he had ever known. She began to understand, with growing unease, that uncovering the truth about Ryder's birth was only the beginning. Something about the thoroughness of the deception, the resources required to falsify records across an outside clinic, the careful construction of a fictional border skirmish, suggested a motive far larger and more dangerous than simply hiding an unwanted human relationship from pack politics. Damon had not just wanted to separate her from Kane. He had wanted to erase, completely and permanently, any trace of her son's true origins. And Elena could not shake the growing, unsettling feeling that she still did not understand why. A week passed before Elena finally decided she had gathered enough proof to bring everything to Kane. She had spent that week collecting every scrap of evidence she could find, organizing it into a careful, undeniable timeline, rehearsing in her mind the exact words she would use when she finally sat him down and told him the truth he deserved to know. She chose a quiet evening, after the clinic had closed and the pack's daily business had settled into the calm of night, and sent word through Priya that she needed a private audience with the Alpha regarding an urgent matter. Kane received her in his private study, a warm room lined with books and framed maps of the territory, a fire crackling low in the hearth. He looked tired when she entered, as though the days since their conversation in the garden had weighed on him as heavily as they had weighed on her. He gestured for her to sit, and she did, setting her case carefully on the small table between them. "You said this was urgent," Kane said, studying her face. "You look like someone about to deliver very bad news." "Not entirely bad," Elena said carefully, her hands trembling slightly as she opened the case. "Some of it is the best news I could possibly imagine, but it comes with a lot of pain attached to it, Kane, and I need you to listen to everything before you react." He nodded slowly, his expression guarded but patient, and Elena began to speak. She told him everything, starting from the beginning, the message she had sent him the night she learned she was pregnant, the silence that followed, the accident, the grief, the years of believing he had abandoned her and that her child had died. She watched his face carefully as she spoke, saw the confusion and pain deepen with every sentence, saw the moment his hands curled into fists against the arms of his chair. "I never received any message from you," Kane said, his voice low and strained. "I told you that already. I would have come to you immediately, Elena. You have to know that." "I believe you," she said gently, "because I found proof of what actually happened." She laid out the documents one by one, the transfer authorization from the outside clinic bearing Damon's signature, the sealed birth record in Ryder's pack file, the historian's confirmation that no border skirmish matching the story of Ryder's parents had ever occurred, and finally, the genetic comparison results, the undeniable scientific proof that the boy Kane had raised for 6 years as his ward shared her blood and his own. Kane went very still as he read through the documents, his breathing shallow, his eyes moving over the genetic results again and again as though he expected the numbers to change if he stared hard enough. When he finally looked up at Elena, his eyes were bright with an emotion so raw it made her chest ache. "Ryder is ours," he whispered, the words barely audible. "He's actually ours." "Yes," Elena said, tears rising in her own eyes as she watched the truth finally settle into him, watched 6 years of quiet, unknowing fatherly love suddenly reveal itself as something far deeper and more real. than he had ever imagined. Cain sat in stunned silence for a long moment, his hand pressed against his mouth, before a different emotion began to rise beneath the shock, something darker and more dangerous. His eyes hardened, his jaw clenched, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the low, controlled fury of an alpha barely restraining himself. "Damon," he said. "This was Damon's doing, all of it." "I believe so," Elena said, "though I don't yet understand why he went to such lengths. Separating us from each other is one thing, but falsifying an entire fictional history for Ryder, constructing a story about a skirmish that never happened, sealing birth records so thoroughly that even the pack historian found no trace of the truth. That level of planning suggests something more than simple disapproval of our relationship." Cain rose from his chair, pacing the length of the study with barely contained tension radiating from every line of his body. "I need to speak with him. Tonight. I need to hear this from his own mouth." "Cain," Elena said, standing as well, placing a steadying hand on his arm. "Whatever you learn, we need to think carefully about how this affects Ryder. He's happy. He's loved. Whatever the truth is behind all of this, he deserves to have it handled with care, not chaos." Cain looked at her, something softening in his expression despite the fury still simmering beneath the surface. "You're right. Of course you're right. But I cannot let this stand, Elena. 6 years. 6 years he kept our son's existence hidden from both of us, and Ryder growing up believing a lie about his own parents. I need answers, and I need them now." He summoned Damon to the study within the hour, and Elena stood quietly near the fire as the two brothers faced each other, the tension between them thick enough to feel like a physical presence in the room. Damon entered with his usual composed expression, though something flickered across his face the moment he saw the documents spread across the table, the genetic results laid out plainly for anyone to read. "Cain," Damon began carefully, "what is this about?" "You know exactly what this is about," Cain said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Explain to me why you intercepted a message meant for me 5 years ago. Explain to me why you arranged for Elena's medical records to be transferred under your authority without her knowledge or consent. Explain to me why my son has spent 6 years believing his parents died in a border skirmish that never happened, according to our own pack historian." Damon's composure cracked slightly, his eyes flicking between Cain's furious expression and Elena's carefully controlled grief. For a long moment, he said nothing, and the silence stretched thin and dangerous between them. "I did what I believed was necessary," Damon finally said, his voice quieter than usual, stripped of its usual confidence. "You have to understand, Cain, the position you were in. A human mate, carrying the future Alpha's child. The elders would never have accepted it, not fully, not without years of political damage to your claim on the throne. I intercepted the message to protect you, to protect the pack, to protect our family's standing during a critical period of transition after Father's passing." "You had no right," Cain said, his voice rising now, the low growl beneath his words unmistakable. "No right to make that choice for me. No right to steal 5 years from Elena. 5 years of watching her son grow up believing she was dead to him and he was dead to her. No right to raise doubts and lies inside a child's history simply to protect political convenience. I protected the throne," Damon said, though his voice wavered slightly, uncertainty creeping into his usually confident tone. "I did what needed to be done. I never expected either of you to discover the truth. I thought, given time, the pain would fade and life would move forward without this complication." "This complication," Elena repeated softly, her voice trembling with barely restrained anger, "is a child, Damon. A living, breathing child who deserved to know his mother, who deserved to grow up without a fabricated story about his own parents' deaths hanging over his history. You didn't protect anyone. You stole something precious from 3 people who never had the chance to choose for themselves." Damon's eyes dropped to the floor, and for the first time since Elena had met him, something like genuine shame crossed his features, though it did little to soften the anger radiating from both Cain and herself. Cain stepped closer to his brother, his presence filling the room with barely contained power, the kind of authority that came naturally to an alpha pushed to the very edge of his patience. "You will answer for this," Cain said, his voice low and final. "Formally, before the pack elders, tomorrow. I will not hide this the way you hid the truth from me for 6 years. Our people deserve to know what kind of leadership you were willing to exercise behind their alpha's back. and what it cost the family you claimed to be protecting. Damon's jaw tightened, but he did not argue, perhaps recognizing that there was no argument left to make. He left the study without another word, his composed exterior visibly cracked for the first time Elena had witnessed since her return to Blackthorn Ridge. When the door closed behind him, Kane turned to Elena, the fury in his expression giving way to something rawer and more vulnerable. "I am so sorry," he said quietly, "for everything you went through, for everything Ryder went through, without either of us knowing. I should have fought harder to find you 5 years ago. I should have questioned the story I was told more carefully." "You couldn't have known," Elena said gently, though her own heart ached with the same regret. "Damon made sure of that. We were both deceived, Kane. Both of us lost years we can never get back. But we know the truth now, and we have a son who is alive and loved, even if the story of how he came to be here was built on lies." Kane nodded slowly, something like determination settling into his expression as the initial shock began to fade into resolve. "I need to tell him, Ryder. He deserves to know the truth about his parents. Gently, carefully, but honestly. I won't let him grow up another day believing a lie." "We'll tell him together," Elena said, and the word together settled between them with a weight that felt, despite everything, strangely hopeful. The following morning, the pack gathered in the Great Hall as word spread quickly that the Alpha had called an emergency assembly regarding a matter of family and leadership. Damon stood before the elders and the assembled pack members, his head held with what little dignity he had left, and confessed publicly to intercepting Elena's message, falsifying medical transfer records, and constructing the false history surrounding Ryder's origins to protect the political stability of Kane's claim to the throne. The pack listened in stunned silence, murmurs rippling through the crowd as the full scope of the deception became clear. When Damon finished speaking, Kane stepped forward, his voice carrying clearly across the Great Hall. "For 6 years, my brother made a choice that was never his to make, at the cost of a mother's years with her son, a son's years with his mother, and my own years of believing myself alone in grief I did not even fully understand. Such a betrayal of trust, from a member of my own family, cannot go unanswered." He formally stripped Damon of his position within the pack's leadership and cast him out from Blackthorn Ridge, a rite of banishment performed before the entire assembly, the weight of pack tradition making the punishment final and absolute. Damon left the territory that same day, his expression unreadable as he walked past the crowd of pack members, who had once respected him, disappearing down the mountain road without a single word of protest. That evening, in the quiet privacy of the lodge, Kane and Elena sat together with Ryder between them, and gently, carefully, told him the truth. That Elena was his mother, that the story he had been told about his birth parents was false, that both of them loved him more than words could express, and that nothing about his life going forward needed to change, except that now, finally, he would know the whole truth of who he was, and where he came from. Ryder listened with wide, careful eyes, processing the enormity of what he was being told, with a quiet thoughtfulness that reminded Elena achingly of his father. When he finally spoke, his voice was small but steady. "So you're really my mom?" he asked, looking at Elena with an expression caught between confusion and cautious hope. "Yes," Elena said, her voice breaking slightly. "I am. And I have loved you every single day of your life, even the days I didn't know you were still here." Ryder considered this for a long moment, then leaned over and hugged her tightly, and Elena wrapped her arms around her son for the first time in 5 years, holding him as though she might never let go again. Kane watched them both, his own eyes bright with emotion, and reached out to pull them both closer, the three of them sitting together in the firelight, a family finally whole after years of stolen time. But even as the warmth of that reunion settled over the small family, Elena could not shake the nagging unease that had been growing steadily inside her for days. Damon's explanation, his claim that he had acted solely to protect Kane's political standing, felt incomplete somehow, too simple an answer for a deception this elaborate and this carefully maintained for 6 long years. There had to be more to it, some deeper reason Damon had gone to such extraordinary lengths, something he had not confessed even under the weight of public exposure and banishment. She kept the thought quiet for now, unwilling to disturb the fragile peace of their reunion, but somewhere in the back of her mind, the question lingered, patient and persistent, waiting for the moment it would demand to be answered. The weeks that followed Damon's banishment settled into something Elena had almost forgotten was possible. A quiet, ordinary rhythm of life, built around mornings at the clinic, afternoons watching Ryder run through the training grounds with the other pack children, and evenings spent slowly, carefully rebuilding the connection between herself and Kane that had been broken for so long. It was not easy. 5 years of separation and grief did not simply dissolve because the truth had finally come to light, and both of them carried scars that needed patience and honesty to heal properly. But there was hope now, something neither of them had allowed themselves to feel in a very long time, and hope proved to be a powerful foundation to build upon. Ryder adjusted to the truth of his origins with the resilience children often possess, though there were quiet moments, late at night, when Elena would find him awake, staring at the ceiling with a troubled expression, working through the enormity of everything he had learned. She spent those nights sitting beside his bed, answering his questions patiently, reassuring him that nothing about who he was had changed, only the story of how he came to be here, and that both of his parents loved him without condition or hesitation. Despite the growing peace within their small family, Elena could not fully release the unease that had settled into her the night Damon confessed before the pack. His explanation, that he had acted purely out of concern for Kane's political standing, continued to feel incomplete, a single thread pulled from a much larger and more complicated tapestry. The thoroughness of the deception nagged at her in quiet moments, refusing to be dismissed no matter how much she tried to focus on the happiness finally within her reach. She began, cautiously, and without telling Kane at first, to dig further into the details surrounding Ryder's birth and the 6 years before his arrival at Blackthorn Ridge. She returned to the outside clinic once more, this time speaking not with Miriam but with an older records keeper who had worked there even longer, a quiet man named Alistair who remembered the chaos surrounding her case with unusual clarity. There was something odd about the whole situation, Alistair admitted when Elena pressed him gently for details. Not just the transfer of records. There was a second visitor, a few days after the first, asking very specific questions about the child's lineage. Wanted to know detailed genetic history, going back generations on both sides. Unusual request for a simple birth record transfer. Elena's stomach tightened. Do you remember who that visitor was? Or what they were looking for specifically? Alistair frowned, trying to recall details buried under years of routine work. I don't remember a name, I'm afraid, but I remember the questions were focused on maternal lineage as much as paternal, as if they were searching for something specific in the bloodline, not simply confirming parentage for administrative purposes. The comment settled uneasily in Elena's mind as she drove back to Blackthorn Ridge that evening, turning the strange detail over and over, trying to understand what it might mean. Why would anyone care so deeply about maternal lineage in a simple case of a pack heir's birth? Her own family history was unremarkable, as far as she knew, ordinary in every sense that mattered to pack politics, unless there was something about her own background she did not fully understand. She decided, after much internal debate, to bring her concerns to Kane, rather than continue investigating alone. Their relationship had grown strong enough over recent weeks that she trusted him completely, with whatever truth might still be waiting to be uncovered, and she suspected he deserved to know, regardless of how the information might unsettle the peace they had only recently found. Kane listened carefully as she explained what she had learned, his expression growing thoughtful and increasingly troubled. Maternal lineage, he repeated slowly. That is strange. Damon never mentioned anything about investigating bloodlines when he confessed. He made it sound like the entire motivation was simply protecting my political standing against pack disapproval of a human mate. I thought so too, Elena said. But this doesn't fit that explanation. If Damon was only concerned about pack politics regarding a human mate, why would anyone be researching my family's genetic history in such specific detail? Kane was quiet for a long moment, his jaw tight with the particular frustration of a man realizing a story he believed to be finished was, in fact, far from over. There's only one way to get real answers, he finally said. We need to find Damon. Locating Damon proved more difficult than either of them anticipated. He had left no forwarding information when he departed Blackthorn Ridge, and inquiries sent through pack channels to neighboring territories returned little useful information. It took nearly 2 weeks of careful searching, aided eventually by a tracker within Kane's trusted circle, before they finally located him in a small town, well beyond pack territory. living quietly under circumstances far less comfortable than the life he had once enjoyed, as second in line to the Alpha throne. Kane traveled to meet him personally, insisting Elena remain behind with Ryder, given the uncertainty of how the confrontation might unfold, though Elena made him promise to return with every detail, no matter how difficult the truth proved to be. When Kane returned 3 days later, his expression was grim, in a way that made Elena's stomach drop the moment she saw him. "There's more to this than pack politics," Kane said quietly, once Ryder had gone to bed, and they were finally alone in the study, the same room where the first truth had unraveled weeks earlier. "Damon told me everything, this time. All of it." Elena sat down slowly, bracing herself for whatever was coming. "The border skirmish story wasn't entirely fabricated for convenience," Kane continued. "It was constructed to hide something specific. Elena, your family line, going back several generations on your mother's side, connects to an old bloodline our father spent years believing he had eliminated entirely. The Draven line." Elena stared at him, the name meaning nothing to her, though the gravity in Kane's voice made her chest tighten with dread. "What is the Draven line?" "A rival pack bloodline," Kane explained, his voice heavy with the weight of old history. "Decades ago, before I was born, my father fought a brutal conflict against the Dravens over territory and leadership disputes that had simmered for generations. The conflict ended with the near-total collapse of their bloodline, and my father was widely rumored, though never openly confirmed, to have ensured that collapse was permanent, complete. No survivors capable of ever challenging Ashford leadership again." "But you're saying survivors did remain," Elena said slowly, piecing together the implications, even as her mind resisted the enormity of what she was hearing. "A few scattered descendants, hidden and unaware of their own heritage, having intermarried into human families over generations to avoid detection. Your mother's side, apparently, carries that bloodline, diluted through generations of human ancestry, but never fully eliminated. Damon discovered this shortly after learning of your pregnancy, through old family records he had access to as second in line. He realized that any child born from your union with me would carry both Ashford blood and Draven blood, uniting two bloodlines whose conflict had defined our pack's history for decades." Elena pressed a hand to her mouth, the full weight of the revelation settling over her like a physical force. "That's why he went to such extreme lengths. It was never really about a human mate being unacceptable to pack politics. It was about preventing anyone from realizing our son carried a rival claim to power." "Yes," Kane said grimly. "Damon believed that if the truth became known, either faction, ours or any remaining Draven-aligned supporters scattered across neighboring territories, might use Ryder as a symbol, a rallying point for renewed conflict. Some would see him as a threat to Ashford leadership. Others might see him as a chance to finally challenge our family's claim to power after decades of believing their bloodline extinguished. Damon decided the safest path was simply to erase the truth entirely, hiding Ryder's existence from everyone, including me, rather than risk the chaos that might follow if either side discovered a child uniting both bloodlines." Elena sat in stunned silence, trying to absorb the enormity of what this meant, not just for her small family, but for the entire territory, and its uneasy history with the pack surrounding it. Ryder was not simply their son, a private joy and private grief reunited after years apart. He was, in the eyes of pack history and politics, something far larger and more dangerous, a living symbol of a conflict decades in the making, capable of either healing an old wound or reopening one that had never truly closed. "What happens now?" Elena asked quietly, fear creeping into her voice for the first time since the truth about Ryder's parentage had first come to light. "If this becomes known beyond our family, what happens to him?" Kane's expression was heavy with the weight of leadership, the burden of decisions that would affect far more than his own small family. "I don't know yet," he admitted honestly, "but I know I cannot make the same mistake Damon made. I cannot bury this truth simply because it is dangerous or complicated. Secrets like this have a way of surfacing eventually, and when they do, they surface with far greater damage than if they had been handled honestly from the beginning. We saw that with our own story, Elena. 5 years of pain, all built on secrets someone else decided to keep for us." Elena reached for his hand, drawing strength from the steadiness she found there despite the uncertainty hanging over them both. "Whatever we decide, we decide together. Ryder deserves parents who choose honesty over fear, even when honesty is the harder path. Kane nodded, his jaw set with quiet determination, though the worry in his eyes remained. There are elders within the pack who remember the Draven conflict firsthand. If word of this reaches them before we control the narrative ourselves, the reaction could be unpredictable, even dangerous. I need time to think carefully about how to handle this, Elena. Time to understand exactly what we're facing, before we decide how to face it. That night, after Kane had gone to check on Ryder one final time before retiring, Elena stood alone at the window of their shared quarters, staring out at the dark shapes of the mountains surrounding Blackthorn Ridge, mountains that had witnessed decades of conflict long before she had ever arrived in this territory. Somewhere beyond those peaks, scattered descendants of a bloodline believed extinguished, lived unaware of their heritage, unaware that a child existed who carried the blood of both sides of a war, fought before he was even born. Elena thought of her son sleeping peacefully down the hall, innocent of the enormous weight now attached to his existence, and felt a fierce, protective determination rise within her unlike anything she had experienced before. Whatever came next, whatever danger or complication the truth of his bloodline might bring, she would not let Ryder become a casualty of politics and old grudges, the way she and Kane had already become casualties of Damon's fear and deception. The peace they had found together over the past weeks suddenly felt fragile, a brief calm before a storm neither of them could fully predict. But Elena had learned, through 5 years of grief and the recent unraveling of every lie built around her, that hiding from difficult truths only delayed the pain, never prevented it. Whatever storm was coming, she resolved to face it honestly, standing beside Kane and Ryder, rather than let fear write their story, the way it had already stolen so much from them. In the days that followed, Kane called together a small circle of his most trusted advisors, elders whose loyalty had been proven over years of service to the Ashford family, to discuss quietly and carefully how the truth about Ryder's bloodline might be handled. Elena sat beside him during these meetings, insisting on being present for every conversation that concerned her son's future, refusing to be sidelined, the way pack politics had so often sidelined her in the past. The elders reacted to the news with a range of emotions that made the path forward feel increasingly uncertain. Some, like the elderly counselor Corwin, who had served Kane's father for decades, reacted with visible alarm, urging Kane to keep the truth buried permanently, warning that any public acknowledgement of Ryder's Draven heritage risked destabilizing the fragile peace that had existed between neighboring territories for years. The Draven name still carries weight among certain factions, Corwin warned during one tense meeting, his voice grave with old memory. There are packs beyond our borders who never fully accepted the outcome of that conflict, who might see a child uniting both bloodlines as an opportunity to challenge Ashford authority once again. Others might see him as a threat requiring elimination before he grows old enough to pose any real danger. Either reaction puts the boy's life at risk, Alpha. Silence may be the safer choice, however uncomfortable it feels given recent events. Elena felt a cold chill at the counselor's words, the casual mention of her son's life being at risk settling into her chest like ice. She glanced at Kane, watching the muscle in his jaw tighten as he absorbed the warning, clearly torn between the desire for honesty and the very real danger such honesty might invite. There is another perspective, offered a younger elder named Celine, who had joined the pack's leadership circle more recently and carried a more progressive view of territory politics. Continued secrecy is what led us here in the first place. Damon's deception nearly destroyed this family and caused immeasurable pain to 2 people who deserved honesty. If we choose secrecy again now, simply because the truth is complicated, we risk repeating the same mistake, only this time with far greater stakes attached. Secrets discovered later, and secrets like this always eventually surface, carry far more damage than truths acknowledged honestly from the beginning. The debate continued for hours, elders divided sharply between those advocating for continued silence and those who believed honesty, however dangerous, offered the only sustainable path forward. Elena listened carefully to every argument, her protective instincts, as a mother warring constantly with her growing understanding of the larger political forces at play. That evening, after the elders had departed and the lodge had settled into quiet, Elena found Kane standing alone on the balcony overlooking the training grounds, his expression distant and troubled as he stared out at the darkening mountains. "What are you thinking?" she asked softly, joining him at the railing. "I'm thinking about my father," Kane admitted after a long moment. "About the choices he made during the Draven conflict, choices that apparently included ensuring their bloodline's complete elimination. I never knew the full truth of what happened during that war, until Damon's confession. I always believed my father to be a fair and honorable leader, and now I have to reconcile that belief with the possibility that he ordered the destruction of an entire family line, simply to secure our own power." "You are not your father," Elena said gently. "Whatever choices he made, you have the chance to choose differently now. That's what matters, Kane. Not the mistakes of the past, but what we choose to do with the truth in front of us today." Kane turned to look at her, something fierce and determined settling into his expression. "I don't want Ryder to grow up in the shadow of secrets the way we did. I don't want him to someday discover the truth of his heritage through betrayal or accident, the way we discovered the truth about each other. If there is a path toward honesty that doesn't put him in immediate danger, I want to find it, even if it takes time and careful planning to get there safely." "Then let's find that path together," Elena said, taking his hand in hers. Over the following weeks, Kane worked carefully and quietly, reaching out through trusted diplomatic channels to gauge the current political climate among neighboring territories, testing carefully whether old wounds from the Draven conflict had truly healed or merely gone dormant, waiting for a spark to reignite old tensions. What he discovered offered cautious hope rather than the outright danger the elders had feared. Many of the neighboring packs, it turned out, held only distant, second-hand memory of the Draven conflict, a story passed down through generations that had gradually lost much of its original bitterness and urgency. A younger generation of leaders now stood at the head of many surrounding territories, leaders who had not personally lived through the original conflict and who, in private conversations carefully arranged by Kane's diplomatic contacts, expressed more curiosity than hostility toward the idea of old rivalries finally finding resolution. There remained, however, a smaller faction, older and more deeply entrenched in the bitterness of the original conflict, who still spoke of the Draven name with barely concealed resentment, holding tightly to grievances passed down from parents and grandparents who had lost family members during the fighting decades earlier. This faction, though smaller in number, remained influential enough within certain territories to pose a genuine risk if the truth of Ryder's heritage reached them without careful, controlled context surrounding its revelation. Armed with this more nuanced understanding, Kane began quietly planning a path forward that balanced honesty with careful diplomacy, recognizing that revealing the truth recklessly could indeed spark exactly the conflict the elders feared, while continued secrecy risked an even more explosive reaction if the truth ever surfaced through less controlled means. Elena, meanwhile, focused her energy on Ryder himself, determined that whatever political storm might eventually arrive, her son would grow up secure in his identity and his sense of belonging, rather than confused or frightened by forces he could not yet fully understand. She spent long afternoons with him, answering his curious questions about pack history in age-appropriate ways, gently helping him understand that his heritage, whatever complicated history it carried, was something to eventually feel proud of, rather than ashamed. "Everyone has a history," she told him one evening, tucking him into bed after a particularly difficult day of overheard whispers among pack members who had begun to sense that something significant was unfolding within the Ashford family, even without knowing the specific details. "Sometimes that history includes difficult chapters filled with conflict and pain, that happened long before we were born, but we get to choose how we carry that history forward. We get to choose to write new chapters, better chapters, even when the old ones were painful." "Am I going to be in danger?" Ryder asked, his young voice carrying a seriousness that broke Elena's heart, a seriousness no child his age should have to carry. Elena hesitated, unwilling to lie to him the way lies had already caused so much damage to their family, but equally unwilling to burden him with fears beyond his ability to process. "Your father and I are working very hard to make sure that whatever happens, you are protected and safe. That is the most important thing to both of us, more important than anything else. We will not let anything happen to you, Ryder. I promise you that." Ryder seemed to accept this answer, though the worry in his young eyes lingered long after Elena kissed him goodnight and left his room. She stood in the hallway for a long moment afterward, her heart heavy with the weight of promises she desperately hoped she could keep. promises that depended on political forces far larger and more unpredictable than any single mother's determination could fully control. As the weeks continued, tension within Blackthorn Ridge began to build in subtle ways, whispers spreading among pack members who sensed that significant decisions were being made behind closed doors, though the specific details remained carefully guarded within Kane's inner circle. Some pack members grew anxious, sensing instability even without understanding its source. Others grew curious, watching Ryder with new interest, wondering privately about the boy's connection to the recent upheaval within the Alpha's family. Kane recognized that he could not delay much longer without risking the truth leaking out through rumor and speculation, rather than through his own carefully planned disclosure. He began drafting, with Elena's careful input, a strategy for revealing Ryder's heritage to the wider pack, and, eventually, to neighboring territories, in a way designed to emphasize reconciliation and healing, rather than renewed conflict. The plan would require immense courage, a willingness to stand before both his own pack and the broader wolf community, with complete honesty about a history many would have preferred to keep buried forever. It would require Elena to step forward publicly as well, revealing her own unexpected heritage as a descendant of the very bloodline the Ashford family had once sought to eliminate. And it would require Ryder, still so young, to understand that his existence carried a weight and significance far beyond what any child should have to bear. But as Kane and Elena worked late into the night finalizing their plans, drawing on Celine's careful diplomatic guidance, and weighing every possible reaction from every faction that might respond to the truth, they both found a growing sense of resolve settling over their fear. They had already lost 5 years to secrecy and deception. They were not willing to lose their son's future to the same forces, however dangerous the path toward honesty might prove to be. The gathering would need to be significant, formal enough to carry the weight and gravity the situation demanded, inclusive enough to bring together voices from across the territories, whose history intertwined with the old Draven conflict. Kane began sending careful, diplomatically worded invitations to neighboring pack leaders, framing the gathering as an opportunity to address old grievances and build toward a more unified future, without revealing the specific truth that would only be disclosed once all parties had gathered together in a controlled, carefully managed setting. As the date of the gathering approached, Elena felt the familiar tightness of fear returning to her chest, though this time, it was mixed with something new, a fierce determination to protect her family, not by hiding from the truth, but by facing it head-on, with honesty and courage, standing beside the man she loved, and the son they had both fought so hard to reclaim. Whatever the gathering revealed, whatever reactions it provoked, Elena resolved that she would not let fear write the next chapter of her son's story, not after everything they had already survived to reach this moment. The days leading up to the gathering passed in a blur of careful preparation, diplomatic correspondence, and mounting tension that Elena could feel pressing against her chest with every hour that brought them closer to the appointed date. Kane worked tirelessly, meeting with Celine and a small circle of trusted advisors to finalize every detail of how the truth would be presented, anticipating every possible reaction from the gathered leaders and preparing careful responses to diffuse hostility wherever it might arise. Elena, for her part, focused on preparing Ryder as gently as she could for the enormity of what was about to happen, though she was careful not to frighten him with details beyond his understanding. She spent quiet mornings walking with him through the territory, answering his questions with patience, reminding him constantly that he was loved, that he was safe, that whatever happened at the gathering, his parents would be standing beside him every step of the way. 3 days before the gathering, a message arrived that sent a fresh wave of unease through the careful preparations. One of Kane's scouts, patrolling the northern border, reported unusual activity near the edge of territory, belonging to a pack known to harbor some of the strongest lingering resentment from the old Draven conflict. Small groups of unfamiliar wolves had been spotted moving through the border woods, their purpose unclear, their presence unannounced through any official diplomatic channel. It could be nothing, Celine said carefully during the emergency meeting called to discuss the report. Border patrols shift regularly, and this could simply be routine movement unrelated to our gathering. Or it could be exactly what we feared, Kane countered, his expression grim. Word may have already leaked, despite our precautions. If certain factions have learned even a fragment of the truth before we've had the chance to present it properly, they may be positioning themselves to act before the gathering even begins. Elena felt fear coil tightly in her stomach at the implication. What does that mean for Ryder's safety? For the gathering itself? Kane's jaw tightened. It means we increase security substantially, and we do not deviate from our plan despite this uncertainty. Canceling now would only confirm that we have something to hide, and give any hostile faction more time to organize against us, rather than facing the truth in a controlled setting, where reason and diplomacy have the best chance of prevailing. The following 2 days passed with heightened vigilance throughout Blackthorn Ridge, additional guards stationed at every entrance to the territory, patrols doubled along every border path, and Elena finding herself unable to let Ryder out of her sight for more than a few minutes at a time, her protective instincts as a mother overriding every attempt at calm reassurance she offered him. On the eve of the gathering, as representatives from neighboring territories began arriving at Blackthorn Ridge, filling the Great Hall and surrounding grounds with unfamiliar faces and cautious, watchful energy, Elena stood beside Kane at the entrance of the lodge, greeting arriving leaders with careful diplomacy, despite the anxiety twisting inside her chest. Among the arriving delegations, one figure caught her attention immediately, an older wolf with silver-streaked hair and sharp, assessing eyes, introduced as Alistair Cade, leader of the territory bordering the northern woods where the scouts had reported unusual activity. His expression carried none of the polite neutrality most other visiting leaders displayed, his gaze instead settling on Elena, with an intensity that made her skin prickle with unease. "Dr. Voss," he said, his voice carrying a note of something Elena could not quite identify, curiosity perhaps, or something colder and more calculating. "I understand you are the reason for this unusual gathering." "I'm simply the territory physician," Elena replied carefully, keeping her expression neutral, despite the alarm rising within her. "Any details regarding the purpose of this gathering will be shared formally tomorrow, as invited." Cade's lips curved into something that was not quite a smile. "Of course. I look forward to hearing the Alpha's announcement." He moved on without further comment, but Elena remained unsettled long after he disappeared into the crowd of arriving delegates, certain that his knowing expression suggested he already understood, or at least suspected, far more than any outsider should have known before the formal disclosure. That night, Elena shared her concerns with Kane as they prepared for bed, both of them too tense to find real rest despite the exhaustion weighing on them after weeks of careful planning. "I think Cade already knows," she said quietly, "or at least suspects. His reaction to my name was too knowing, too calculated to be simple curiosity." Kane's expression darkened with worry. If Cade knows, it likely means the northern faction, the same faction whose scouts our own patrols spotted along the border, has learned some version of the truth already. We need to be prepared for the possibility that tomorrow's gathering may not unfold the way we planned. "What do we do?" Elena asked, fear tightening her voice despite her effort to remain steady. Kane took her hands in his eyes meeting hers with a steadiness that offered some measure of comfort despite the uncertainty surrounding them. "We do exactly what we planned. We tell the truth, clearly and completely, before anyone else has the chance to twist it into something more dangerous than it actually is. The truth, presented honestly, is our strongest defense against whatever distorted version Cade or anyone else might try to spread. We cannot control how people react, Elena, but we can control how clearly and honestly we present the facts." Elena nodded, drawing strength from his resolve even as her own fear refused to fully settle. They checked on Ryder together, before finally attempting to rest, finding him asleep, his small face peaceful, and unaware of the tension gathering around him like storm clouds on the horizon. Elena stood watching him for a long moment, memorizing the innocent calm of his expression, wondering how much longer that innocence would remain untouched by the complicated, dangerous truth of his heritage. The morning of the gathering arrived clear and cold, the great hall filled to capacity with representatives from every neighboring territory, elders from Blackthorn Ridge, seated in positions of honor near the front, and a palpable tension humming through the assembled crowd, as word had clearly spread that something significant was about to be revealed, even if the specific nature of that revelation remained unknown to most present. Elena stood beside Kane near the front of the hall, Ryder positioned carefully between them, his small hand gripped tightly in hers, as the weight of hundreds of watching eyes settled over their small family. Across the hall, she caught sight of Cade seated among the northern delegation, his expression carefully neutral now, though his eyes remained fixed on their family with an intensity that made her pulse quicken with renewed unease. Kane stepped forward to address the assembled crowd, his voice carrying clearly across the silent hall, steady and strong despite the enormity of what he was about to reveal. Elena watched him take a deep breath, felt Ryder's small hand tighten around her own, and braced herself for whatever consequences the truth might bring, hoping desperately that the honesty they had chosen would prove strong enough to overcome whatever danger still lingered at the edges of this carefully orchestrated gathering. "I have called you all here today," Kane began, his voice resonating with the authority of his position, "to address a truth that concerns not only my own family, but the history and future of every territory represented in this hall. A truth that I believe, if faced honestly and courageously, offers not division, but an opportunity for healing decades in the making." The hall fell into absolute silence, every eye fixed on the Alpha King as he prepared to reveal the secret that had shaped his family's pain for years, and that now threatened to reshape the entire political landscape of the territories surrounding Blackthorn Ridge. Kane continued speaking, his voice steady despite the enormity of the moment, carrying clearly across the silent hall. He told the assembled leaders about the conflict decades earlier between the Ashford family and the Draven bloodline, a story many in the room already knew in fragments passed down through generations, though few understood its full details. He spoke honestly about his father's role in that conflict, about the widespread belief that the Draven line had been completely eliminated, and about the recent discovery that this belief had been mistaken. Murmurs rippled through the crowd as Kane explained that scattered Draven descendants had survived, hidden through generations of intermarriage into human families, their heritage unknown, even to themselves. He watched the reaction carefully as he continued, his hand finding Elena's free one, drawing strength from her steady presence beside him. "Dr. Elena Voss," Kane said, turning slightly to acknowledge her, "carries that surviving Draven bloodline through her mother's lineage, though she herself only recently learned this truth. Our son Ryder, therefore, carries both Ashford blood and Draven blood, uniting two lines whose conflict defined this territory's history for decades before either of us were born." The hall erupted into a wave of startled murmurs, some leaders exchanging alarmed glances, others leaning forward with obvious curiosity, the reaction as varied and unpredictable as Kane and Elena had feared it might be. Across the room, Cade rose slowly from his seat, his expression hardening into something cold and calculating. "And you expect us to simply accept this revelation?" Cade's voice cut through the murmuring crowd, carrying an edge of barely restrained hostility. "A child uniting the very bloodlines whose conflict cost my own grandfather his life, presented to us now, years after the fact, as some kind of gesture toward healing?" Kane held his ground, his voice remaining calm despite the challenge. "I understand this truth is difficult, Alpha Cade. I understand the history between our families carries real pain that cannot simply be erased by a single announcement. But I did not gather you here to demand acceptance. I gathered you here because continued secrecy, the very secrecy that has already caused immeasurable harm to my own family, seemed a far more dangerous path than honesty, however uncomfortable that honesty might prove to be." "Dangerous to whom?" Cade pressed, his eyes flicking toward Ryder with an expression that made Elena's protective instincts flare sharply, her grip tightening around her son's small hand. "Dangerous to your family's comfort, perhaps, but what of the danger this child now represents, whether he intends it or not? A living symbol, capable of reigniting old claims to territory and power that many of us believed settled decades ago." Before Kane could respond, another voice rose from among the gathered elders of Blackthorn Ridge, an old woman named Ingrid, whose family had served the Ashford territory for generations, and who carried enough respect among the older factions present to command immediate attention when she spoke. "I remember the Draven conflict," Ingrid said, her voice steady despite her age, carrying the weight of first-hand memory few others in the hall could claim. "I remember the grief on both sides, the families torn apart by a war that, if we are honest with ourselves, none of us fully understood the true cost of until it was far too late to prevent. I also remember that the fighting began not because either bloodline sought conquest, but because fear and misunderstanding escalated into violence neither side could control once it began. Perhaps this child, born of both bloodlines through circumstances none of us could have orchestrated, offers something none of us expected. A chance to finally close a wound that has bled quietly for decades, rather than reopening it further. Her words settled over the hall with unexpected weight, and Elena watched as several of the gathered leaders exchanged thoughtful glances, the initial alarm giving way, in some faces at least, to genuine consideration of Ingrid's perspective. Cade, however, remained unmoved, his expression still hard with old grievance. Sentiment is easily offered by those who did not lose family in that conflict, he said coldly. My grandfather died defending our territory against Ashford aggression, and I will not pretend that old wound heals simply because a child exists who happens to carry both bloodlines through circumstances of chance rather than intention. Then what would satisfy you, Alpha Cade? Kane asked directly, his voice firm but not unkind. What outcome do you believe would properly address the history between our families, if not honest acknowledgement, and the possibility of moving forward differently than our predecessors did? Cade was quiet for a long moment, clearly caught off guard by the direct challenge, his earlier hostility flickering with something like genuine uncertainty. I don't know, he admitted finally, his voice quieter than before. I have carried this grievance since childhood, inherited from a family that never fully recovered from what your father's actions cost us. I am not certain any single gesture could fully resolve decades of inherited pain. Then perhaps resolution isn't found in a single gesture, Elena spoke up, stepping forward despite her nervousness, her voice carrying clearly across the hall. Perhaps it begins with a choice, made today, to stop passing inherited pain forward onto children who had no part in creating it. My son did not choose his bloodline, Alpha Cade, any more than you chose the grief passed down to you by your family's history, but we all have a choice in how we carry that history forward, from this point onward. The hall fell silent again, the weight of her words settling over the assembled crowd. Cade studied Elena for a long moment, then looked toward Ryder, who stood quietly between his parents, his young face solemn, with an understanding beyond his years, watching the exchange with careful, thoughtful eyes that reminded Elena, even in this tense moment, achingly of his father. He is only a child, Cade finally said, his voice softer now, some of the hardness fading from his expression, as he seemed to truly see Ryder for the first time, not as a political symbol, but as a small boy caught in the middle of history, far larger than himself. Yes, Kane said quietly, he is, and he deserves the chance to grow up without inheriting a war that began before he was even born, just as your own children and grandchildren deserve that same chance, Alpha Cade. That is what I am asking of everyone gathered here today. Not forgiveness demanded, not old grievances erased by decree, but simply the willingness to consider a different path forward than the one that has defined our territories for generations. The silence that followed stretched long and heavy, every leader in the hall clearly weighing the enormity of what was being asked of them, the pull between old inherited grievances and the possibility, however uncertain, of a genuinely different future. Elena held her breath, watching faces across the crowd, searching for some sign of how this pivotal moment might ultimately resolve. Finally, Cade sat back down slowly, his expression still troubled but no longer openly hostile. I will need time to consider this properly, he said. This is not a decision to be made hastily, in the heat of a single gathering. But I will say this. The willingness to speak this truth openly, rather than continuing the secrecy that apparently caused your own family so much pain, does suggest a different intention than the aggression my family has long associated with the Ashford name. It was not full acceptance, not the immediate resolution Elena had desperately hoped for, but it was, perhaps, a beginning, a crack of possibility opening, where only hostility had existed moments before. Around the hall, other leaders began speaking quietly among themselves, and Elena caught fragments of conversation, suggesting cautious curiosity, rather than outright rejection, among many of the gathered delegations. Kane addressed the hall once more, his voice steady with the particular relief of a man who had braved an enormous risk and found, if not complete success, at least the possibility of a path forward, rather than immediate catastrophe. I do not expect resolution today, he said. I only ask that we begin the conversation honestly, rather than allowing old grievances and hidden truths to fester in silence, the way they have for far too long already. My family made mistakes, born of fear and misguided attempts at protection. I do not intend to repeat those mistakes with my son's future, or with the future of the relationships between our territories. As the gathering slowly began to disperse into smaller conversations among the various delegations, the immediate tension in the hall easing into something more manageable, though still far from fully resolved, Elena felt Kane's hand tighten around hers, a silent acknowledgement of the enormous risk they had just taken together, and the uncertain but hopeful path that now stretched ahead of them. She looked down at Ryder, who gazed back up at her with a small, tentative smile, clearly relieved that the tense confrontation had not erupted into the violence he had perhaps feared. Elena knelt down and pulled him into a gentle hug, grateful beyond words that her son had witnessed, on this pivotal day, not violence or rejection, but the slow, difficult, necessary work of honest reconciliation beginning to take root. The gathering was far from over, and many difficult conversations still lay ahead in the days and weeks to come. But for the first time since the truth of Ryder's heritage had come to light, Elena allowed herself to feel something she had not dared to feel in a very long time. Genuine hope. The days following the gathering brought a strange mixture of relief and lingering tension to Blackthorn Ridge. Word of Kane's announcement spread quickly beyond the assembled delegations, reaching every corner of the surrounding territories within days, and the reactions that followed proved just as varied and unpredictable as the response within the Great Hall itself. Some territories sent formal messages of cautious support, acknowledging the courage required to address old history honestly, rather than allowing it to remain buried. Others sent nothing at all, their silence carrying its own uncertain weight. The northern faction, led by Alpha Cade, remained the most concerning unknown. Though Cade had left the gathering without open hostility, his final words carrying a note of cautious consideration, rather than outright rejection, Kane's scouts continued to report unusual activity along the northern border in the days that followed, small groups moving through the woods, with purposes that remained unclear, despite careful observation. Elena found herself unable to fully relax into the fragile hope the gathering had offered, her protective instincts as a mother remaining heightened with every report of movement near the border, every unfamiliar face that appeared within Blackthorn Ridge's markets or training grounds. She kept Ryder close, accompanying him more often than usual to his lessons and activities, unable to shake the persistent worry that the danger surrounding their family had not yet fully passed. Nearly a week after the gathering, that worry proved justified, in a way that sent fresh terror through Elena's heart. Ryder had gone with a small group of pack children to the Eastern Training Grounds for an afternoon lesson under the supervision of trusted instructors, a routine activity Elena had allowed, only after careful consideration of the increased security measures Kane had implemented throughout the territory. She was in the middle of examining a patient at the clinic when Priya burst through the door, her face pale with alarm. "Elena, you need to come now. Something happened at the training grounds." Elena's heart dropped instantly, ice flooding through her veins as she abandoned her patient and ran, following Priya through the territory toward the eastern grounds, her mind spinning through every terrible possibility as her feet carried her faster than she thought possible. When she arrived, she found a chaotic scene, pack guards moving urgently among the training area, several instructors speaking rapidly with Kane, who had clearly been summoned the moment the incident occurred. "Where is he?" Elena demanded, her voice raw with fear, searching desperately through the gathered crowd for any sign of her son. "Where is Ryder?" Kane turned to her immediately, his expression tense but controlled, and gestured toward a small group near the edge of the grounds, where Elena finally spotted Ryder sitting on a low bench, wrapped in a blanket despite the mild afternoon warmth, a guard standing protectively at his side. Relief crashed through her at the sight of him alive and apparently unharmed, though his face carried an expression of shaken fear that made her chest ache with fresh worry. She rushed to him immediately, pulling him into her arms, checking him over frantically for any sign of injury, even as he assured her, in a small, trembling voice, that he was unhurt. "What happened?" she asked, looking up at the nearest instructor, an older wolf named Corwin, who had been supervising the training session. Two unfamiliar wolves approached the eastern edge of the grounds during the lesson, Corwin explained, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. They attempted to draw Ryder away from the group, under the pretense of needing help finding a lost item near the tree line. Fortunately, One of the other instructors noticed the unfamiliar scent immediately and intervened before the strangers could get Ryder beyond the ground's boundary. Our guards gave chase, but the intruders escaped across the northern border before they could be apprehended. Elena's blood ran cold at the implication, holding Ryder even tighter as the full danger of the situation settled over her. Someone had attempted to take her son, likely connected to the same factions, still processing the truth of his heritage, still uncertain whether he represented hope for reconciliation or a threat requiring elimination. Kane's expression had hardened into something fierce and protective, the same barely restrained fury Elena had witnessed the night they first confronted Damon, returning now with even greater intensity. "I want every available guard doubled along the eastern and northern borders immediately," he ordered the assembled instructors and guards. "No child leaves the central grounds without direct supervision from trusted personnel until we understand exactly who is responsible for this and what their intentions truly are." That evening, after Ryder had finally settled into an uneasy sleep, exhausted from the fear of the day's events, Elena and Kane sat together in the study, both of them shaken by how close they had come to losing their son barely a week after finally reclaiming their family. "We need to find out who was responsible," Elena said, her voice tight with barely controlled fear and anger. "Was it Cade's faction, or someone else entirely, someone who sees Ryder as a threat rather than an opportunity for peace?" "I don't know," Kane admitted, his own frustration evident in the tension of his shoulders. The scent trail led toward the northern border, but that alone doesn't confirm Cade's direct involvement. There are other factions within that region who might act independently, hoping to use Ryder to further their own agendas, whether that means eliminating him as a perceived threat, or attempting to use him as leverage in ways we haven't yet considered. Elena felt the fragile hope from the gathering crumbling beneath the weight of this new danger, the peace they had begun to imagine feeling increasingly distant and uncertain. "Maybe honesty wasn't enough," she said quietly, doubt creeping into her voice for the first time since they had decided together to reveal the truth publicly. "Maybe we made a mistake, Kane. Maybe we should have found another way, some way that didn't put Ryder directly in danger like this." Kane took her hands in his expression gentle despite the exhaustion and worry etched into his features. "I understand why you're doubting our choice, Elena. Truly I do. But think about what continued secrecy nearly cost us already. If we had chosen silence again, hidden Ryder's heritage indefinitely, we would have been living under the constant threat that the truth might surface anyway, through less controlled circumstances, at a moment we couldn't predict or prepare for. At least now, we know where the danger is coming from. We can prepare properly, protect him properly, rather than living in constant uncertainty about when and how the truth might eventually force its way into the open." "That's a difficult comfort to hold on to," Elena said, though she recognized the truth in his words even through her fear. "I know," Kane said softly, "but we are not facing this alone anymore, Elena. We have the support of many within our own pack, and increasingly, cautious support building among several neighboring territories as well. The attempt today came from a faction still clinging to old fear and hostility, but it does not represent the full response to our announcement. We need to strengthen our alliances with those willing to support genuine reconciliation and address this threat directly, rather than allowing fear to convince us that honesty itself was the mistake." The following days brought intensified security throughout Blackthorn Ridge, along with careful diplomatic outreach to territories that had responded favorably to Kane's gathering, seeking their support in identifying and addressing whoever had orchestrated the attempted abduction. Slowly, through careful investigation and cooperation from allied territories, evidence began pointing not toward Cade's faction directly, but toward a smaller, more radical splinter group operating within the northern region, individuals who rejected any possibility of reconciliation and viewed Ryder's existence as an unacceptable threat requiring immediate elimination, regardless of broader diplomatic consequences. When this information reached Cade himself, delivered through careful diplomatic channels by Kane's allies, the Northern Alpha responded with what appeared to be genuine outrage, sending an urgent message condemning the attempted abduction and pledging his own forces to help identify and neutralize the radical faction operating within his territory's borders, without his sanction or knowledge. "Whatever grievances I carry regarding our shared history," Cade's message read, according to the diplomatic envoy who delivered it personally to Blackthorn Ridge, "I do not condone violence against a child, regardless of the complicated politics surrounding his existence. I will work to ensure those responsible are held accountable, and I extend, for the first time in my own memory, a genuine offer of cooperation between our territories in addressing this threat." The message offered Elena and Kane a fragile but genuine glimmer of hope amid the fear and uncertainty of recent days, evidence that their choice to embrace honesty over continued secrecy had, despite the danger it had also invited, opened doors toward alliance and understanding that years of silence and suspicion had never managed to achieve. It would not resolve the danger immediately, and Elena knew the coming weeks would require continued vigilance and careful diplomacy to fully address the radical elements still determined to see Ryder as a threat rather than a symbol of possible peace. But as she watched Kane work tirelessly, alongside newly cooperative allies to track down and neutralize the threat against their son, and as she held Ryder close each night, reassured by the increased protection surrounding their family, Elena allowed herself to believe, cautiously but genuinely, that the path they had chosen, however dangerous and difficult, remained the right one. The truth, however costly to reveal, had begun building bridges where secrecy had only ever built walls, destined to eventually collapse under their own weight. And for her son's future, for the possibility of a life built on honesty, rather than inherited fear and hidden history, Elena found she was willing to face whatever additional danger still lay ahead. 3 weeks after the attempted abduction, the combined efforts of Blackthorn Ridge and Cade's Northern Territory finally located and neutralized the radical splinter group responsible, a small band of extremists who had been operating largely independent of any formal territory leadership, driven by inherited grievances passed down through generations, without the moderating influence of broader diplomatic relationships. Their capture, achieved through careful cooperation between forces that had been bitter rivals only weeks earlier, marked a turning point that neither Elena nor Kane could have fully anticipated when they first made the difficult choice to reveal the truth publicly. The successful joint operation between Blackthorn Ridge and the Northern Territory did more than simply neutralize an immediate threat. It became, in the months that followed, the foundation for something neither Kane nor Cade had truly believed possible only weeks earlier: a genuine working alliance between territories whose history had been defined by conflict and suspicion for decades. Regular diplomatic exchanges began, cautious at first, then increasingly substantive, as leaders on both sides discovered that cooperation, born from the shared goal of protecting an innocent child, offered benefits far beyond the immediate crisis that had brought them together. Elena watched this transformation unfold with a sense of wonder she had not expected to feel, given how much danger and uncertainty had accompanied the truth's revelation. The path from that first tense confrontation in the Great Hall to genuine, if still cautious, cooperation between former rival territories had not been easy or straightforward, but it had proven, gradually and unmistakably, that Ingrid's words at the original gathering carried real wisdom. Sometimes the deepest wounds required honest acknowledgement before they could truly begin to heal, rather than continued silence that only allowed old pain to fester indefinitely beneath the surface. Ryder, too, seemed to find his footing more securely with each passing month, the fear and uncertainty of the abduction attempt gradually giving way to a more settled confidence as he watched his parents navigate the complicated politics surrounding his heritage with steady determination and care. He began to understand, in ways appropriate to his growing age, that his existence carried genuine significance beyond simply being a beloved son, that he represented, for many across the territories, a living symbol of the possibility that old conflicts did not have to define the future indefinitely. "Do you think Alpha Cade actually likes me now?" Ryder asked one evening, nearly 6 months after the original gathering, as the family sat together in the study, reviewing plans for an upcoming diplomatic visit to the Northern Territory, the first time Ryder himself would travel beyond Blackthorn Ridge's borders, since the truth of his heritage had become public knowledge. "I think Alpha Cade is still learning how to move past decades of inherited grief," Elena said carefully, choosing her words with the honesty she had promised herself she would always offer her son, even when the full truth remained complicated. "But I do believe he has come to see you as an individual, rather than simply a symbol of old conflict. That's a meaningful change, Ryder, even if it took time and courage from everyone involved to get here." Kane reached over and ruffled Ryder's hair affectionately. pride evident in his expression as he watched his son grapple thoughtfully with questions far beyond what most children his age would ever need to consider. "You have handled everything asked of you this past year, with more courage and grace than many adults could manage," Kane said. "Whatever comes next, whatever challenges still lie ahead, as our territories continue building this fragile new alliance, I know you will continue meeting them with that same strength." The diplomatic visit to the Northern Territory, when it finally arrived, proved to be a moment of genuine significance, marking the first time an Ashford heir had set foot within Draven-descended territory in living memory, without hostility, without conflict, but as an honored guest, extended genuine welcome by leaders who had once viewed his very existence as an unacceptable threat. Cade himself greeted the family personally at the territory's border, his expression carrying none of the cold hostility from their first meeting, replaced instead by a cautious warmth that spoke to months of careful relationship building between the two territories. "Welcome," Cade said, extending his hand toward Kane in a gesture that carried far more weight than the simple words themselves. "I admit, I did not imagine, 6 months ago, that I would ever willingly welcome an Ashford heir into my territory. But I have come to believe that perhaps this arrangement, difficult and unprecedented as it remains, offers something valuable that decades of continued hostility never managed to achieve." "Thank you for your willingness to consider a different path," Kane replied, shaking Cade's hand firmly. "I know it required real courage to move past inherited grievances toward something new." The visit continued over several days, filled with careful diplomatic meetings, shared meals between families who had once considered each other enemies, and quiet moments where Elena watched Ryder, interacting cautiously but genuinely with children from the Northern Territory, building small friendships that, only months earlier, would have seemed impossible given the weight of history separating their families. By the time the family returned to Blackthorn Ridge, the alliance between the two territories had solidified into something Elena finally allowed herself to believe was genuinely lasting, rather than merely a fragile response to shared crisis. Other neighboring territories, watching the successful cooperation between Ashford and Draven-descended leadership, began reaching out with their own tentative overtures toward strengthened diplomatic relationships, the ripple effects of Kane and Elena's difficult choice toward honesty spreading gradually outward across the broader network of territories that had once existed, in careful, suspicious isolation from one another. Nearly a year after Elena had first driven through the gates of Blackthorn Ridge, uncertain and afraid of confronting a past she believed long buried, she found herself standing on the same balcony where Kane had once confessed his confusion and grief over her disappearance, watching the sun set over mountains that no longer felt heavy with unresolved history, but instead carried the quiet promise of a future built on honesty rather than fear. Kane joined her, wrapping his arms around her from behind, resting his chin gently against her shoulder as they watched the colors shift across the darkening sky together. "Do you ever think about how different everything might have turned out?" he asked quietly, "if Damon had never intercepted that message all those years ago?" Elena considered the question carefully before answering. "I used to think about it constantly, in the early days after learning the truth. All those stolen years, all that unnecessary pain. But I've come to believe that dwelling too long on what might have been only steals from what we have now. We found each other again. We found our son. And somehow, through everything we've faced together this past year, we found a path toward genuine peace between territories that spent decades locked in silent hostility. I wouldn't trade what we've built, even knowing how much pain it took to get here." Kane pressed a gentle kiss against her temple, his voice soft with the particular contentment of a man who had finally found, after years of uncertainty and loss, everything he had once believed permanently beyond his reach. "I love you, Elena. I have loved you since long before I understood the full weight of what our story would eventually require of us, and I am endlessly grateful that our son gets to grow up knowing the truth of who he is, rather than carrying the burden of secrets the way we once did." "I love you too," Elena said, turning in his arms to face him fully, her heart finally settled after years of uncertainty and grief that had once felt permanent and unshakable. "And I'm grateful, every single day, that the truth found its way to us, however difficult that path proved to be." Below them, in the courtyard, Ryder's laughter rang out clear and bright as he played with several other pack children in the fading evening light, his voice carrying that same distinctive warmth that had first caught Elena's attention the very day she returned to Blackthorn Ridge, the sound that had unknowingly begun unraveling 5 years of carefully constructed lies. Now that laughter carried no hidden grief beneath it, no buried secret waiting to surface and cause fresh pain. It was simply the sound of a happy child, secure in his identity, surrounded by parents who loved him completely, and a growing community of territories slowly learning to build trust, where suspicion had once reigned unchallenged. Elena watched her son play beneath the darkening sky, felt Kane's steady presence beside her, and allowed herself, finally and completely, to release the last remnants of fear that had shadowed her return to this territory nearly a year earlier. The Alpha King had once hidden a secret son from her, a secret born of fear and misguided attempts at protection, that had cost them both years of unnecessary grief. But in uncovering that secret, and the even larger truth hidden beneath it, they had discovered something far more valuable than the pain the deception had originally caused. They had discovered that honesty, however dangerous and difficult, offered the only true foundation for lasting peace, whether within a single family or across generations of territorial conflict. And standing together now, watching their son's laughter fill the courtyard below, Elena finally understood that some secrets, once uncovered and faced honestly, did not simply heal old wounds. They built entirely new futures, stronger and more genuine than anything built on silence could have ever hoped to become.